In chapter 1 of Race Matters, Cornel West discusses the major issue of nihilism in Black America. And so he specifically says that you have this clash of solutions between the liberal structuralists and the conservative behavioralists. So he alluded to that distinction in the introduction. So we're going to kind of expand on that idea more. So the liberal structuralists basically are saying that in order to overcome Black poverty, Black nihilism, this despair that they're experiencing, we have to basically have more structures and institutions and more money to support and uplift these individuals. So have full employment, have health insurance, have more social safety nets to help these individuals, have important programs, social programs, affirmative action. So have government and structural policies that uplift these individuals. And so you have the conservative behavioralists, though, on the other side who are saying, hey, no, this has to do with their behaviors. This has to do with their choices. They need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and engage in self-help programs. They need to have better leadership, and there needs to be more expansion of Black businesses. And so we should never have any preferential job practices. We should just have the free market, and that should just dictate things. And so Cornel West is basically saying both of these strategies are problematic because they assume that social structures and our individual behaviors are separable. And Cornel West is saying no, our behaviors and the structures that we find ourselves in society are not separable. They are in fact inseparable. And so we can't necessarily reduce a problem to just solely a structure or solely a behavior, because they always exist amongst one another. So our individual behaviors and choices and our free will, they exist within the society, within the context that we live in. They exist and they are impacted by the media that we see, by the laws that we have to respect and maintain, by the education we have in our school system, by the things we learn about in history classes, for example, by the language that we use. So we can't just understand behaviors and structures as being isolated from one another. We have to think about how they exist amongst one another. So of course there are structural issues, which he does talk about in chapter 5, but there are also behavioral issues with nihilism. And so what is this idea of nihilism? With nihilism, if you think back to existentialism with Sartre, he was arguing against nihilism. He was saying, yes, life doesn't necessarily have inherent meaning and purpose to it, but we can attribute that inherent meaning, or we can attribute that meaning and purpose to it when it comes to our own lives. But with nihilism, it kind of it goes in a different direction and says, okay, well, life is inherently meaningless. There isn't a purpose to my life. No one cares about me. My society doesn't care about me. I'm going to amount to nothing, so I'm just going to give up. So it's this idea that you don't care, you're apathetic, and you give up. And so he says it leads to a detachment of oneself from other people, and it leads to self-destruction, whether it's with not applying for jobs or not becoming educated or turning to drugs or something as a means of self-medication. And so with this nihilism, it leads to a life of apathy without hope, and there's no meaning. There's an eclipse of meaning. And so for Cornel West, he is coming from a Christian perspective. He is religious. He believes faith and hope are good things, and they help people get through their day-to-day lives. And so without this hope, it's really hard to try to change one situation. It's really hard to say, yeah, I'm going to try, and I'm going to wake up, and I'm going to apply for all these jobs today, when you don't necessarily believe something's going to happen or something positive is going to happen. And so he sees this nihilism as reflected in higher suicide rates amongst Black youth, which is really, really devastating, since these structural forces and racism and classism are negatively impacting people's mental health. So these aren't just abstract problems. These are really internalized within people's lives. And so of course we have to do something about this. And so if we lived in a society perhaps that was less focused upon these market forces, that was less so intense with wealth inequality, that was less dominated by corporate market institutions that pretty much own the means of production, that pretty much own various companies, then perhaps people would have more freedom to feel like, yeah, I have agency, I can do this. But if you just have a few corporations that have a monopoly over all aspects of life and global aspects of life too, then it's really hard to feel like, yeah, I can change things, because in fact it is a lot harder. Just think about different corporations that are lobbying governments, that lobby Congress. And so therefore these industries are so powerful because they have this big business backing them up. So that leads to a lot of unethical actions in our society because money talks, and money unfortunately has more of a value than real people. And that's Cornel West's larger argument here, with how there are structural forces that do need to change. And we also have to kind of go beyond this culture of consumption that, oh, you know what, I'm feeling bad today, so I'm going to go buy myself a watch. Or, oh, the true American dream is owning property and having a car and, you know, being able to buy myself whatever I want. And so we have to kind of get away from that limited notion of self-medication and say, you know what, maybe I need to look deeper at my life or make some important changes in my life so that way I don't feel like I have to buy myself something in order to feel better about myself. So we have to go beyond that culture of consumption, that whole notion of, oh yes, I see the ad for French fries and now I'm hungry for French fries, right? The billboard for French fries. And so we have to not be so robotic. We can't just allow ourselves to always self-medicate with buying things. And he also addresses how this culture of consumption leads to angst. So thinking back to existentialism, this notion of angst is when we realize our full and profound responsibility not only for ourselves but for other people. And so Cornel West discusses it in terms of the angst that specifically African American individuals feel living in a society that doesn't value them and that doesn't respect them. And so he says that it leads to a type of anxiety. It leads to just this collective clinical depression in Black America that is really hard to kind of escape and really hard to navigate and get out of. And he says, he refers to it as a Black existential angst, where there are these deep wounds that the community is experiencing, and they are these deep kind of ontological wounds that are woven into their very being. So it's really hard to walk amongst other people and have this lightness when one experiences this heaviness and this lack of concern from the rest of society, or people just constantly blaming individuals for negative situations that they can find themselves in. And he says that this is really directed at African American women, who are the most vulnerable in society because they're dealing with racism but also sexism. And so we'll talk more about these potential solutions in the next video.